The man's hand shook as he reached into his pocket. He could hear the soft crinkle of the paper as he pulled out the note. His heart hammered in his chest. The sound of boots hitting the ground above him echoed in the cold, damp tunnel. He held his breath, trying to stay as still as possible. Every muscle in his body screamed, but he knew if he made a noise, it would be over. He stared at the piece of paper. It was more than just a note. It was the key to his future, the key to his family's survival. But for now, it felt like a death sentence. He had crossed a line, and if anyone found out, there was no going back. He heard the boots pause. His throat tightened. For a moment, the world felt like it had stopped. The silence was deafening. A cold sweat ran down his spine. If he moved now, he would be caught. If they saw him, they would take everything. His life, his money, his hope. He could hear the boots getting closer. His breath caught in his chest. What would happen next? How did this man end up here? Deep underground? Trying to hide a secret so dangerous it could destroy everything? The answer begins far away. Across an ocean, in a world where money rules everything. It all started in a land called France, a powerful country that had once ruled over much of Africa. Over the years, it had built an empire that spanned continents, and with that empire came great wealth. But when the empire collapsed, when the flags of France were lowered in those African colonies, something strange happened. France didn't leave. They stayed, but not in the way you might think. Imagine a house of cards, strong, tall, and standing in a perfect tower. But even the strongest house can fall with a single push. That's what happened after the colonial powers left. The countries in Africa were free, sort of. They had their flags, they had their governments, but they had no real power. The strings were still pulled by those who had ruled them before. Now imagine a country like France, sitting at the top of this pile of cards. Instead of leaving when the countries gained independence, France made a deal. They would control something crucial. Something that no country could survive without. Money. While many African nations were left struggling with poverty, France had one hand on the purse strings. This wasn't just about wealth. This was about control. By printing the money for 14 African nations, France was making sure that no matter how many years passed since independence, these nations would always owe something to their former colonizer. In these African countries, their money was printed in France. It was controlled by France. And in return, France took the profits. They weren't just printing cash. They were printing power. It was a secret agreement that few knew about. A quiet, unnoticed deal that would keep France's grip on these nations stronger than ever. But the people knew something was wrong. The economy was always fragile. Prices seemed to rise while the people stayed poor. It was as if the system was rigged from the start. What France had done was more than just a simple act of control. It was a masterstroke in economic warfare. It started small. In the beginning, nobody really noticed. The deals were quiet, almost hidden in plain sight. But as time passed, the cracks began to show. The African countries, still reeling from years of colonial rule, were struggling to build stable economies. They didn't have the infrastructure, the resources, or the power to control their own money. France, however, had all of that. By controlling the currency, they controlled everything. But then, everything changed. One man, a leader in one of these nations, saw it. He understood the game that was being played. He began to speak out. The people, who had long suffered in silence, started to listen. His name was Thomas Sankara. Sankara was young, bold, and unafraid. He had risen to power in Burkina Faso, a country that had struggled under the weight of France's economic control. He could see that his people were shackled by debt. It was as if they were constantly paying off a price they didn't even agree to. It wasn't right, and he was determined to change it. But he wasn't alone in this fight. All around Africa, leaders began to feel the heat. They saw what Sankara was doing, and they knew it couldn't be ignored. The pressure was building, and France was feeling it. They had worked too long and too hard to maintain control. They knew the game was at risk of being exposed. Then came the mistake. Sankara, in his quest to break free, made a bold move. He demanded that his country print its own money. No longer would Burkina Faso's currency be printed in France. This was a declaration of independence, not just politically, but economically. And France didn't take it well. They pushed back hard. France had always made sure that no African country could truly control its own wealth. Without that control, France would lose too much. They had the system set up so tightly that one small mistake could unravel it all. And Sankara had just made that mistake. The news spread like wildfire. His move to break away from French control sent shockwaves through the continent. But it wasn't just about Burkina Faso. It was about every nation tied to France's monetary system. It was about freedom. But Sankara didn't stop there. He didn't back down, even when the world seemed to turn against him. He knew this was a fight worth having. But nobody saw what was coming next. The moment arrived when everything changed. France, with its economic might, wasn't about to let a small nation shake its control. The pressure on Sankara grew. The international community, including former colonizers and world powers, started to distance themselves from him. The whispers were getting louder. They called him a troublemaker. They said he was destabilizing the region. And just like that, the tables turned. One night, in the dead of darkness, a coup was staged. Thomas Sankara was overthrown. The very man who had tried to break free from the economic chains was silenced. And in his place, a new leader emerged. One who was far more willing to play by the rules. A leader who understood that in the world of global power, some strings are too dangerous to cut. The coup was quick, sudden, and devastating. The forces behind it were swift and ruthless. Sankara's vision died that night. His dream of an independent, self-sustaining Africa was crushed, not by bullets, but by the unseen hand of money. France had won, and with it, the control over an entire region's future. But the damage was done. The story of what Sankara tried to do couldn't be erased. It couldn't be forgotten. His death was only a temporary setback, and the voices of others who wanted change grew louder. But the story of Sankara wasn't the only one. All across Africa, the tension was building. Nations like Côte d'Ivoire, Senegal, and Mali began to realize that the system wasn't working. The money that France controlled kept their economies weak. They saw that what had happened to Sankara could happen to them too. But then, something unexpected happened. In the face of all the pressure, one leader, a quiet but determined man named Alpha Condé, took a stand. He was different from Sankara. He understood that freedom was not just about kicking out the colonizers. It was about breaking the cycle of economic dependency. In the midst of it all, France was trying to hold on. They had always been the master of this game. They knew the stakes. If Africa ever learned to print its own money, they would lose more than control over a few banks. They would lose everything. But Alpha Condé and others weren't ready to give up. The seeds of rebellion had been sown, and the winds of change were slowly beginning to blow. It all came to a head faster than anyone expected. The tension had been building for years, but now it was at the breaking point. One by one, the leaders who dared to challenge the system found themselves under attack. France had watched closely as more and more countries demanded change. They knew the stakes. If one nation succeeded in breaking free, it would inspire others. The whole foundation of their control could crumble. And so, they moved swiftly. But the real explosion came when France decided to act. They tightened their grip. It wasn't just about money anymore. This was about survival. The stakes were life and death. The people of Africa weren't going to take it any longer. They had seen what had happened to leaders like Sankara. They knew that their countries were still slaves to a foreign power, even decades after gaining their so-called independence. The cries for freedom were loud, and they were getting harder to ignore. One day, an economic crisis hit. The currency began to crash. Prices soared, businesses closed, and families struggled to survive. It wasn't just a few nations. It was widespread. The money that France controlled was now working against the people it was meant to support. The very system that was meant to prop them up was now breaking them down. In the midst of this chaos, a bold leader in Mali named Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta made a decision. It was time to challenge France, no matter the cost. He declared that Mali would print its own currency. The people cheered. It was a move that symbolized hope. Hope for a future where Africa was no longer shackled by colonial pasts. But France wouldn't let it happen. Within days, there were signs that something dark was on the horizon. France didn't just sit back. They moved quickly. A sudden wave of economic sanctions hit. The cost of imports skyrocketed. The currency crashed harder. The people were suffering, and the pressure was unbearable. In the background, whispers of military coups began to stir. The moment of truth arrived when Keïta was arrested in a swift, decisive action by forces loyal to the old system. The dreams of an independent, self-sustaining Mali were crushed in one fell swoop. The streets erupted in anger. The people demanded answers, but the truth was hard to swallow. The coup was engineered not by the people, but by the invisible hand of the very nation that still controlled their money. It wasn't just Mali. Across the continent, leaders who had once dared to dream of independence found themselves facing similar fates. They were silenced, one after another. The push for economic freedom was met with overwhelming resistance. France had played this game for too long. They knew the consequences of losing control, and they were willing to do whatever it took to maintain their grip on these nations. The chaos spread. The political landscape of Africa was shifting. But with every step forward, France managed to pull them 2 steps back. When the dust finally settled, the situation hadn't improved. The people were still trapped in a system that worked against them. France had maintained its control, and the dreams of economic independence were dashed. But something had changed. The struggle for freedom, for self-sustaining economies, didn't end with the coups. It lived on in the hearts of the people. The fight was far from over. The idea that Africa could one day be free from the chains of economic dependency wasn't to just a fantasy. It was a reality waiting to be fought for. The lesson was clear. Freedom isn't just about independence from colonial powers. It's about breaking the chains of economic control that continue to hold you down, even after the flags come down. France's grip on these 14 nations may seem unbreakable, but the fire for change burns bright, and one day it might just be strong enough to light the way. The final sentence echoes through the years. The past might shape the present, but it's the future that holds the key to freedom.